The honourable member for Gippsland.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And I rise to speak in relation to the Carbon Pollution Reduction Scheme Bill of 2009 and associated bills. And in joining the debate, Deputy Speaker, I do feel compelled to state my disappointment, my ongoing disappointment, in fact, with the government's handling of this issue. And I agree with one thing from the previous speaker: this is a very serious and very complex issue. But I fear that the government seems to be pursuing a political strategy rather than an environmental strategy in this regard. Everything from the timing of the proposed legislation before the House to the comments of the Prime Minister and the ministers themselves is about achieving some form of political advantage on the back of community concerns over the forecast impacts of climate change. I fear that the government has become so obsessed with its political strategy that it's turned its back on Australia's national interest. And I will be supporting the amendments that have been put forward by the coalition and the negotiations which are currently underway with the minister, in an attempt to try to minimise the damage that this scheme can do to the Australian economy. But I do make the point that it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever to pursue this legislation before we have a clear understanding of what action, if any action, our major trading partners are prepared to take and the rest of the world is prepared to take in relation to the environmental challenges we are faced with. Without a global agreement, Deputy Speaker, I fear that we're voting to give foreign companies a competitive advantage over our own companies. We're voting for more expensive power and transport costs. We're voting for more expensive food. We're voting to increase costs for all our small businesses. We're voting for a massive new tax on every part of our lives. Now, the government, I believe, has failed to make the case and answer some of the most basic questions in relation to the CPRS that's before the House. It hasn't come clean with the Australian public and been honest with the Australian public to let them know how much it's going to cost extra to build a house in a new CPRS environment. How many jobs in regional areas will be affected by this legislation before the House? And how does Australia, cutting its emissions without any global consensus, actually achieve anything in terms of global environmental outcomes? I fear the government has developed a strategy for spinning this issue to the broader Australian public, but it's not trusted the Australian public with a full explanation of the complexity of this scheme. And I do appreciate that it is a very complex scheme, but they haven't even tried to explain this in clear language to the Australian public. And in fact, I think they've embarked on a course of deliberately hoodwinking the Australian public into believing that this is the answer to their concerns in relation to climate change. And the government has failed to explain to the Australian public how this legislation before the House threatens their job security without achieving, as I said before, without achieving significant global environmental benefits. I think as Australians have come to understand this legislation, it's a bit like when you leave a prawn out in the sun, Deputy Speaker. Now, the prawn looks fine at first, and you leave it out there for a little bit longer, it starts to smell a bit. And it's a bit like that with this legislation. It looks fine at first, but the more you look at this scheme, the more it starts to stink. And I think the Australian public is just starting to understand now that there's a lot more to this CPRS legislation than originally met their eyes. And my concern is the government has embarked on this strategy deliberately taking advantage of the goodwill of the Australian public. There is goodwill out there in terms of trying to take action for sustainable environmental management, but I don't believe the government has taken the Australian public into its confidences and explained exactly what the impacts of this scheme will be. So my disappointment with the bills before the House and the government strategies is consistent, Deputy Speaker, with the views of many Gippslanders who have contacted my office. To begin with, the government hasn't been honest with how Australia, when its total emissions are 1.4% of total global emissions, and how Australia is setting a target of a 5% reduction in CO2, how that's going to save the Great Barrier Reef and the Kakadu National Park, as the Prime Minister quite often states in this place. How does Australia, when we're talking about a 5% reduction of a 1.4% total, achieve a massive environmental achievement, according to the Prime Minister, of saving Kakadu and the Great Barrier Reef? It is an enormous con and it doesn't stand up to any scrutiny whatsoever. And the member for Mackellar was right earlier this evening when she described it as a hoax. It's a cruel hoax and it's a betrayal of the goodwill of the Australian public. There is support, as I said, Deputy Speaker, for action on climate change, but Australians are being conned into believing that this is the answer. There is no Australian solution to climate change in isolation. There needs to be a global commitment. Another disappointment that I have is the government hasn't told the Australian public what the CPRS will cost in terms of the impact on each region. And that's one of the great frustrations for the people of my electorate, in particular the Latrobe Valley, where the absence of any regional impact statement has made it almost impossible for the community to get an understanding of what the cost-benefit is of this particular legislation before the House. My electorate is one of the most exposed to this policy of any community in Australia, perhaps even the most exposed when you consider the existence of the Latrobe Valley brown coal power generators, the oil and gas industry, quite a large dairy industry in the McAllister Irrigation District. And Deputy Speaker, the power industry in the Latrobe Valley is the most important industry to my community, bar none. And I've informed the House before that Latrobe City Council has commissioned its own analysis on an independent report into the economic importance of the Latrobe Valley coal and electricity industries. And the report was prepared last year, and it basically found that the coal and electricity industries sectors provide $802 million per year, or 21.2% of the gross regional product of the Latrobe Valley. There's 125 people employed in the coal mining sector and 1,705 people employed in the electricity supply sector. The flow-on impacts or the flow-on benefits from the industries are enormous in terms of the opportunities for private contractors and the overall wealth of the Gippsland Latrobe Valley region and the broader Victorian economy. The broader Gippsland impacts could be enormous if the industries in my region are disadvantaged as a result of the carbon pollution reduction scheme. And I fear that there are several thousand jobs at risk in my electorate over the next 10 to 15 years under this scheme. But unfortunately, Deputy Speaker, that is my back-of-the-envelope assessment, because the government, as I said, has refused to be honest with the people of Gippsland and actually undertake the modelling and let us know what the cost benefits are of its plans. We do have the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry report earlier this year, which found that rural and regional areas will be adversely affected and could lead to increased urbanisation. It was interesting that the Treasurer was in here before speaking about the support from business. Well, the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, in the report it released in June this year, had put a statement out at the same time. It's an organisation which represents some 280,000 small and medium-sized enterprises, and in its statement in June, the study recognised that the small and medium-sized enterprises, particularly those involved in manufacturing, will face prices which face prices set in international markets due to import price parity. And as a consequence of that, the trade-exposed SMEs have limited opportunities to pass the cost on to their customers, but are not eligible for assistance under the proposed CPRS transition package. Increases in energy and transport costs will impact directly on SME employment and profitability. The study finds that the CPRS in its current form will generate additional costs that would erode firm profitability by between 4 and 7% on average. Now, the Treasurer liked to tell us that the impacts on businesses would not be significant because they weren't among those large emitters. But there you have the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry indicating that a drop in profitability of between 4 and 7%, which, if anyone in the government side actually ran a business, is a very significant concern for them indeed. The New South Wales government actually tabled a report which found that regional areas could have a 20% decline in economic activity. So there's some of the reports that have looked at the impacts on rural and regional communities of the CPRS legislation before the House. As I said, Deputy Speaker, in my electorate we have the key industries which will be impacted directly by the CPRS, including the electricity generation, the dairy industry and the oil and gas activities in Bass Strait. And these are jobs that we have now, and I'll take up the contributions from some speakers on the government side who suggested there's thousands of new jobs to be created. Well, Gippslanders would rather have the job in the hand they've got right now than some airy-fairy promise about jobs which may come down the track. There are major plans for expansion of the gas production in Bass Strait, but the industry has several concerns with how it will be affected under the government's plans. And some of those concerns the government has failed to address, which the industry has brought to my attention, is that in the absence of the details, it's not possible for the industry to have clarity as to the eligibility or levels of assistance included in the scheme under debate. Therefore, it's not possible to have any confidence that the competitiveness of Australian-based industry will be maintained relative to our international competitors. And in terms of the treatment of the emissions-intensive trade-exposed industries, as a consequence of the government's proposed two tiers of 60% and 90% of assistance, one of the consequences of that is that the Australian emissions-intensive trade-exposed industries will bear costs associated with the CPRS, which are not borne by our international competitors, and that will result in the potential for the Australian industries being priced out of the global market. Keep in mind the gas industry is trading into a global market, and some trade-exposed industries may not qualify for any assistance whatsoever. And it does make a mockery of the Australian Labor Party's 2007 election commitment, and I quote, "to ensure that Australia's international competitiveness is not compromised by Australia's response to climate change, and that Australian operations of emissions-intensive trade-exposed firms are not disadvantaged by emissions trading." Clearly, the oil and gas industry is one which has grave concerns about whether the government is true to its election promise in that regard. I do recognise, Deputy Speaker, that there could be future opportunities in my electorate related to the opportunity for renewable energy technology and for the clean coal and capture and storage. But these are, as I said previously, these are jobs in the future which may or may not develop depending on as the technology is developed. There are real concerns in the Latrobe Valley region, for example, regarding the clean coal and the capture and storage, that we are talking about decades down the track rather than the jobs which are just around the corner. And we look at initiatives such as wind energy, which has been the subject of much debate throughout the broader Gippsland region, and there have been constant calls from the community for more control for local communities in terms of having their say into the siting of these, what is an industrial activity on agricultural land. Given the seriousness of the issues before the House, Deputy Speaker, you would have thought that we would have a very mature level of debate in this place, but many times over the past six months I have been disappointed with the juvenile level of debate and the attempts to typecast members as either true believers or as climate change sceptics. This is a place where I believe there is room for robust debate and for dissent on issues of significance to the Australian economy and the Australian community in general. But I think the government has been deliberately very divisive in the way it's treated the whole issue of the emissions trading scheme and climate change in general. We've seen the propaganda-style advertising campaigns of last year, which have been designed to scare people, scare children, and it does no credit, I think, to the Prime Minister or his government that they've embarked on this course, which I believe is a political strategy much more than an environmental strategy. And not for a second, Deputy Speaker, do I want anyone to believe that I'm anything other than a committed environmentalist. I'm very much a pragmatic and a practical environmentalist in many regards. I'm a member of Landcare in my own community, a member of Watermark, a group which is committed to sustaining the Gippsland Lakes and protecting our local waterways. But I do believe in practical environmental work rather than some of the posturing that we've seen from members opposite as they lecture us on what is appropriate in our communities. It's quite ironic that we're having this debate on the environmental future of our nation when at the same time the government has cut funding to the professional facilitators involved with the Landcare organisation. So I'm one who believes in sustainable management of the environment, Deputy Speaker, and there's not a single person in Gippsland who will disagree with me about the need for practical environmental measures. But as I said earlier, I believe this is more of a political strategy being driven by the government than an environmental strategy. I believe that the CPRS before the House poses a far greater risk to the future of Australian agriculture than much of the climate change forecasts we've talked about. I certainly support efforts by the Coalition to have agriculture excluded and recognise the opportunities for future abatement, which will have great potential for our rural sectors in the future. I've said previously that I was disappointed with the way the government has sought to divide our nation in this regard in its treatment of the CPRS legislation, and by its constant attacks on people who raise any concerns about the CPRS. It really is driving a wedge between Australians who are instinctively quite uncomfortable with some of the extreme green religion and the more doomsday scenarios which are out there. There are many people in my electorate who are committed to working hard to protect the environment. They're doing the work right now on the ground, and I'm frustrated by the way the government has sought to typecast people as believers or sceptics in this regard, when we have so many people who are prepared to volunteer their time and effort to help create a sustainable environment in our own electorates. As I said, Deputy Speaker, Gippsland is at the pointy end of this debate. It's one of the regions most exposed in Victoria and possibly Australia, but the government still has failed to inform us what the impacts will be in terms of our key industries of the brown coal power generation, the oil and gas industry and the agriculture sector. The Latrobe Valley in particular should be proud of its contribution to the wealth of our nation over many decades, but it's been vilified, I believe, by this scare campaign, this divisive nature of the government's campaign in relation to climate change. In the Latrobe Valley we have massive reserves of brown coal, which has underpinned the economic development of Victoria for many decades, and we will still depend on that brown coal for a reliable and secure baseload energy supply into the future. We need the Latrobe Valley power generators to remain commercially viable and to invest in the research and the technology required for a cleaner coal future, which I referred to earlier. The government has offered generators $3 billion in compensation, but the loss in asset values is more likely to be in the vicinity of $10 billion, we understand. It's been left to John Brumby, the Premier of Victoria, to actually stand up for the generators because no one in the Rudd government has been prepared to do so. And I refer to an article in the Age newspaper on the 23rd of October, where the headline, Brumby in cash plea. It refers to senior federal government sources told The Age that Premier John Brumby had this year become the leading advocate for greater compensation for coal-fired power stations. An industry consultant agreed, saying, "I think Brumby and a couple of his ministers do more lobbying than the industry." The source suggested the Premier was concerned about the financial shock of the scheme causing generators to shut down, disrupting the power supply. And a quote, "If you're the Premier and the lights go out, well, your lights are going to go out pretty soon afterwards," he said. That just about sums it up, and welcome to the real world to members of the government who think that you can implement these changes and inflict this massive loss on the asset values of Latrobe Valley power generators without any impact whatsoever. If the power generators are not financially viable under this government's CPRS, we're all in for a shock in terms of the reliability of our baseload power supply in this nation. The Yallourn Power Station Management has already indicated that it has reduced its maintenance, and once you have a power station reducing its maintenance workload, it's inevitable that the reliability of supply will be affected in the future. I've said it previously in the House, and I'll say it again tonight, Deputy Speaker, to paraphrase Rupert Murdoch and many others, but I am one who is prepared to give the planet the benefit of the doubt in relation to the issue of climate change, and I do accept that we're going to need to have changes to the way we manage our economy into the future. But we do need a strong and sustainable economy to deal with some of the challenges that are presented to us. The mitigation measures, which have been talked about by others, if sea level rises occur anywhere near as predicted, will require vast amounts of infrastructure to be moved or protected. And you're going to need to do that from a position of economic strength, and that's important for the government to consider in terms of its handling of this whole issue. Which gets probably to my biggest disappointment with the government's handling of the issue, and that it's been prepared to place Australia's national interests secondary in its pursuit of a political strategy. And I fear that there's a risk of Australian jobs being lost as a direct result of implementing a scheme which puts us at a competitive disadvantage with our trading partners. And under the Rudd government's model before the House, we run the risk of jobs being exported from Australia to nations which don't have a comparable scheme. And a fear that's regularly expressed to me in my electorate is that we will be sending jobs offshore. We'll also export our carbon emissions to those nations, and the net result will be deterioration in the world's environment because the nations which take the jobs will have less stringent environmental protocols than Australia in the first place. So any scheme which transfers jobs from Australia in high-emitting industries to foreign nations is likely to result in a poor environmental outcome. And I fear that this scheme will add to economic uncertainty in Australia and export jobs to foreign nations, resulting in increased global emissions. So, Deputy Speaker, in conclusion, I come back to where I started. The proceeding ahead of negotiations in Copenhagen to lock Australia into any scheme is premature at best and likely to result in negative economic consequences. I say it's likely to result because, quite frankly, the government has failed to do its homework in terms of the economic modelling and refused to be honest with the Australian public and outline the full impacts of this scheme. We haven't seen any modelling done on the impacts of individual regions, particularly in the context of the deterioration in the global financial situation over the past 12 months. It simply lacks common sense to proceed down this path without full knowledge of where the rest of the world is prepared to go and without knowing what our major trading partners and some of the biggest emitters are prepared to do. The bills before the House are flawed and they represent a massive breach of trust with the Australian community. Even the most fervent of the climate change advocates will acknowledge that Australia acting alone will not have a significant environmental impact. The government is prepared to inflict enormous economic pain on regional areas like Gippsland and the Latrobe Valley for insignificant environmental gain.